It was just another night on the road, the headlights of the car slicing through the endless darkness, the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt providing a strange sense of comfort. But that comfort began to fade as they neared a gas station on the side of the highway. It was an isolated one, the kind of place you could easily miss if you weren't looking closely. The station was the only sign of civilization for miles, but the moment they saw it, something felt wrong. The lights flickered and buzzed, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. The sign for the station was barely visible, and the air felt unnaturally cold. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years, yet the pumps were still functional, the building still standing. They pulled up to the pumps, the low fuel light on their dashboard reminding them of their dwindling options. As they stepped out of the car, the strange feeling intensified. The cold wind cut through them despite the warmth of the summer night. The station was eerily silent, no sounds except for the occasional creak of metal. The only sign of life was a single attendant behind the counter, a man who looked out of place. His eyes were distant, his movements slow, like someone trapped in a world where time didn't flow correctly. The group went to the counter to pay for the gas, but something about the man's gaze made them uneasy. His eyes didn't blink, and he seemed to be staring right through them. When they asked for the gas, his response was chilling. "Fill up. You'll need it." The group looked at each other, but there was no turning back now. As the attendant refueled the car, the group stood at the edge of the station, watching the empty road ahead. They could have sworn they saw something move in the shadows just beyond the lights, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. As they climbed back into the car and prepared to leave, the air grew colder still. The attendant's voice suddenly echoed through the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, though his lips never moved. The words seemed to come from all around them, a disembodied presence that made their skin crawl. The car wouldn't start. Panic set in as they tried to restart the engine, but the car remained silent. Then the lights flickered again, and the attendant was standing just outside the window, his face now twisted in a grotesque grin. The wind howled, and the air felt thick with something unnatural. Suddenly, a loud screeching noise filled the air, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and the world around them seemed to warp. The gas station became a different place, darker, more sinister. The road in front of them was now a dead end, and the attendant was nowhere to be seen. The car's engine sputtered and the car lurched forward on its own, as if guided by some unseen force. The headlights flickered on and off, casting long shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The group realized too late that they had crossed into another realm, one where time and space no longer followed the rules. As they tried to escape, the figure of the attendant appeared in the rearview mirror, but his face was no longer human. His features were distorted, his eyes wide and black as pits. The car's engine revved louder, but no matter how fast they drove, they couldn't escape the terror that followed them. It was as if the station itself had a life of its own, and it wasn't letting them go. By the time they reached the end of the road, it was too late. The lights of the gas station were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. They had driven in circles, never truly leaving the station behind. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the attendant's grin as he whispered one last time, "You shouldn't have come." The car cruised down the empty highway, the engine purring steadily beneath them. The stars above flickered dimly in the night sky, barely visible through the thick clouds that had rolled in. There was no one else on the road, no other lights in sight. It had been hours since they last passed another vehicle, and they were beginning to feel the weight of isolation. But the low fuel light on the dashboard reminded them that they couldn't go much further without stopping. They spotted a gas station up ahead, its lights flickering erratically. as if struggling to stay on. It was an old, run-down place, the kind of station you wouldn't normally stop at unless you had no choice. But desperate times called for desperate measures, so they pulled in, hoping to fill up and get back on the road quickly. The air felt unusually cold as they stepped out of the car. There were no sounds, no rustling of leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence. The station itself looked abandoned, with broken windows and peeling paint. The only sign of life was the dim light spilling from the door, where an elderly man stood, staring out at them. His face was pale, his eyes vacant, as if he hadn't seen anyone in years. He didn't say anything when they approached. He simply nodded toward the pumps, his movements stiff and jerky. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's gaze lingered too long, and as they filled up their car, they noticed how the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the station, and the lights flickered again. The man was gone. The door to the station slammed shut, and the car's engine sputtered. They tried to restart it, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic began to rise in their throats. What was going on? Then, without warning, the door to the station opened again, and the man stepped out. His face had changed. His skin was now pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and unblinking. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a grin that sent a chill down their spines. "You should leave," he whispered, but his voice wasn't his own. It was hollow, distant, like it came from somewhere far away. They turned to get back in the car, but it was too late. The station was no longer the same. The world around them had shifted, the sky turning dark and the air growing thick. The car's engine roared to life on its own, the tires screeching as the vehicle tore down the road. But no matter how fast they drove, the station was always there, looming just behind them. They could feel the presence of the man watching them, could feel his eyes following them, even when they couldn't see him. The road twisted and turned, each corner leading them back to the same place. The gas station, the man, the darkness. It was all closing in on them, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape. They were trapped in the endless loop, the station now a prison from which there was no escape. As the car sped down the endless road, the man's voice echoed in their minds. "You should have never come," he said. "Now you'll never leave." It had been a long, tiring drive, the kind where the road stretches on forever and the hours seem to blend together. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the low fuel light had been flashing for miles. They needed to stop for gas, and there was no other option in sight. They spotted a small gas station ahead, tucked away at the side of the road. The lights inside flickered faintly, and the station appeared abandoned. The windows were cracked, and the sign above the door was barely visible. Still, they didn't have a choice. They pulled in, hoping to get some fuel and move on. As they stepped out of the car, the air felt different. Cold, heavy, as if something was watching them. The station was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of anyone around. The only sound was the distant rumble of the engine as it powered down. They approached the pumps and saw the door creak open slowly. An old man stood there, his eyes cold and lifeless. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was stuck in some sort of trance. He didn't speak as they approached. He simply pointed toward the pumps, and they began to fill up their car. The whole place had a strange, oppressive feeling, like they were intruding on something that shouldn't be disturbed. The man's gaze never wavered, his eyes fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. As the car's tank filled, they noticed something strange. A mirror on the wall of the station reflecting their image. But when they looked closer, they saw that the reflection was wrong. Their faces were distorted, their features twisted and stretched. It was as if they were looking into a world that wasn't their own, a world where things didn't quite fit. One of them turned to the man, but when they looked back at the mirror, The reflection had changed. Their own faces were no longer in the glass. Instead, there was something else, something dark, something malevolent. The figure in the mirror was watching them, its eyes wide and empty. They backed away slowly, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. It stayed there, frozen, its eyes following them as they turned to leave. But as they walked toward the car, the door to the station slammed shut behind them, and the mirror began to crack. The cracks spread quickly, the reflection warping and distorting. They tried to get in the car, but it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered and the air grew thick with dread. The man's voice echoed from behind them. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered. They turned around, but the man was gone. In his place was only darkness. The reflection in the broken mirror began to move, the figure within it stepping out of the glass and into the real world. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real, and it was coming for them. As the figure stepped closer, their screams were drowned out by the sound of glass shattering, the world around them collapsing into darkness. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, black as pits, staring right into their soul.